Murdoch's Music Minute is back with a little extra, something out of my usual schedule or usual content. Not looking exactly at an album or a discography today, but rather talking about a music documentary. And the subject is or are the Beach Boys. Yes. Fans and those moderately interested in the band have been talking about this one for quite a bit now. Disney Plus has launched or commissioned a documentary on the band, which is now available via streaming. And I wouldn't consider myself an absolute hardcore Beach Boys fan, but a Beach Boys fan who goes at least, deeper than the usual greatest hits surface by now. Of course, I was interested. I watched this one and thought I'll give a little review about this documentary, which is simply titled The Beach Boys. So if this sounds interesting to you, or if you maybe already also have watched The Beach Boys on Disney Plus, grab some popcorn and follow me into the realm of music documentaries. The Beach Boys, a new documentary streaming on Disney Plus, will give you a very nice general overview of the Beach Boys as a band, but it certainly will not provide you with the full picture. Here are my 2 cents on it. So this documentary runs for almost 2 hours. It was produced by Frank Marshall, who is a main figure in 1980s and 1990s Hollywood, but he's better known as a producer than as a director. So what exactly drew him to do this project is a bit unclear to me. Apparently he is interested in music. He comes from a musical family himself. I think his father is a film composer and his brother as well. But on the other hand, or at the same time, apparently he didn't know too much about the Beach Boys. So yeah, interesting. It would be interesting to know more about the motivation behind this project. The documentary itself is done very competently. It, floats along quite nicely, especially if you are not a hardcore Beach Boys fan who wants to know more about very specific details. The documentary glosses over those aspects rather quickly. You don't get to know a lot about musical details, to be honest. So if you are a fan of the band who wants to get more into the musical aspects, or maybe even the music theory analysis of the music of the Beach Boys or the production techniques, you won't get that too much from this documentary. But then at the same time, I think you have to be aware, or we should keep in mind, that I don't think this was the intention of the Beach Boys, the documentary. There are a few aspects that I think are worth criticizing. I came to it a little bit skeptical, almost hesitant, because the combination Disney, Beach Boys felt to me like, well, I was expecting to get a very, glossy, superficial, and, well, sunny side up version of the Beach Boys story and their history. When, after all, if you look into the Beach Boys, a little bit deeper, then this is actually band history full of missteps, but also actually human tragedy and human misbehavior, I would even say. There are a lot of dark or tragic aspects in the Beach Boy history, Most of all, of course, Brian Wilson, but not only him. So I was expecting maybe to get a little bit of a, sugar-coated version of the Beach Boys. And the beginning of this documentary almost had my worst nightmares come true, because it already starts with the Beach Boys were about harmony, and this harmony came from being a family. And at that point, and I think that's basically the first minute of the documentary, I really felt like, oh my God, now this really is the Disneyfication of, pop music history. There's nothing wrong with family. I certainly share family values, but Disney really doesn't need to hammer that into our minds with each and every of their products. But then the documentary, fortunately, quickly gets the right tone for me. And after all, of course, the Beach Boys mostly were a family with all its pros and cons. Certainly a lot of cons later on in the history, but I'll get to that later. What I really enjoyed about the first third of the documentary is the archival footage that is used. You get a lot of old photographs and even black and white old film footage. Some of it even looks like, private film footage from the Wilson family, or at least from, peers, friends, neighbors. And that's what I found really fascinating and entertaining. And it really gives you a feeling of, this Hawthorne, this, I think, small town in California in the late 50s, early 60s, teenagers going to the drive-in, enjoying their hamburgers and Coke, and, goofing around with friends and starting singing, enjoying rock and roll radio. Of course, as is common with most rock documentaries or documentaries in general, you get the story told by means of a lot of interviews. So what you see basically are talking heads. But this is very elegantly and, as mentioned, in a good pace, interspersed with a lot of archival footage, videos, promotional videos of the band, a bit of live performances, TV appearances, etc. What I really found extremely cool in this documentary is that David Marks gets, at least of course in the first part, he gets a lot of time to, tell the story of the Beach Boys from his perspective. He was more or less an original member, but very soon left the group, also under pressure from Murray Wilson, who is more than an ambivalent figure in the history of the Beach Boys. Of course, you have the various band members on camera. Most of them are shown in older videos, so it's archival footage with Dennis Wilson and Carl Wilson. That's only logical since they both have passed away already. Also, Brian Wilson is briefly shown with recent footage in the beginning of the documentary, but then his interviews all are, come from the off, and I think most of them or all of them are older interviews, but that's also not very surprising. If you see Wilson in this documentary, he really looks frail, and as probably most of you know, that's not just because of his age now, but also because of his recent, I think, Alzheimer's disease diagnosis. And he really looks frail, and it's a bit saddening to see him in this condition, to be honest. A lot of the interview time, the recent interviews done for this documentary, is given to Mike Love. Take it or leave it, he more or less is the speaker of the band now, or he has been for several decades now. Al Jardine and Brian Johnston have at least a little bit of interview time and can tell about, history from their perspective. I personally would have wished to have a bit more of them also on camera, or to have a bit more balance in the interviews, but well, it is what it is. Also, given that the Beach Boys were made up of, several family members, good friends, different individuals, the individual characters of the band members always remain a bit vague, even though Al Jardine talks about how he came up with the idea to record Sloop John B, for example. And that's the only moment where we briefly get to know that Al Jardine actually had a past or his roots in, folk music. And it's mentioned so quickly that you almost you almost don't notice it. Despite all these little details and snippets of interviews, or you never get deeper into the personalities of the individual Beach Boys. Biggest focus, of course, always has been on Brian Wilson and his kind of personality, or his also struggles with his personality, and his mental struggles are well documented, especially in books, etc. But the rest of the Beach Boys, even though the documentary makes it very clear that their contribution was equally important to shaping the sound of the Beach Boys, and it's not just, Brian Wilson, the lone musical genius with, interchangeable Beach Boys providing the vocals. You never get to know more about, or you don't really come close to the other Beach Boys as persons. At least that's my opinion. We get the typical traditional narrative retold again. So Mike was the kind of entertaining extrovert guy, especially on stage. He was the funny clown, but he also could be a bit bossy, a bit pushy, and he was the one who, in the background, was very much focused on, the band having hits and getting in the money. Carl is the sensitive guy with the voice of an angel, and he later on often also was described as the soul of the band, but we never get to know more about him as a person. And Dennis forever will remain, the sunny boy, the sex symbol of the band, the best looking guy who was the only one who was also into sports. He was a ladies' man. He was a bit of maybe a risk seeker. And he was also the only one who really could surf. But still, that doesn't give me, a deeper understanding or a deeper knowledge of, the Beach Boys as individual persons. Maybe that's just me as someone with a background in psychology who always looks for those aspects when reading about artists or watching documentaries, and probably there wouldn't have been enough time within 2 hours to really go deeper into the personalities. But I think it's interesting that, especially with the Beach Boys, they always seem to be a little bit on their guards, even in interviews, and don't, disclose too much of their own feelings or opinions or personalities in interviews, at least not in the interviews that I've seen here. Other than that, of course, we have a few people who, accompanied the Beach Boys along their way in interview, and experts and musicians who talk about the Beach Boys as well. Though with some of those other musicians or, music experts that are interviewed, I don't really get why they were exactly chosen for this documentary. The only actual peer of the Beach Boys who can be heard but not seen is Paul McCartney. Other than that, we get people like, for instance, Lindsey Buckingham or Don Was, producer. And to be honest, their comments about the Beach Boys don't really add a lot or are not very informative. I think the most important external interviewee to be seen is cultural historian Josh Kuhn, or Kahn, I had to look up his name again, who provides some really profound and great analysis of how the Beach Boys created a certain image. And he also has a great comment on the so-called rivalry between the Beatles and the Beach Boys, and describes how that not only had an impact on, both of those bands, but how that also had a wide-ranging impact on popular culture in general. Other than that, some of those interviews or interview partners who are not the Beach Boys seem a bit random, to be honest. But we also get an interview with Brian Wilson's first wife, which I think is pretty cool. And she talks, of course, about the heyday of the Beach Boys, actually, and a bit more of how Brian Wilson felt during those, on the one hand, very successful, and on the other hand, very stressful years. And for a while then, the documentary focuses on Brian Wilson. It's inevitable with the Beach Boys. I think the years 65, 66, 67 are very much, the Brian Wilson show. And of course, then they actually very quickly skip through the career of the Beach Boys. Some hits, some well-known hits, are played for a few seconds in the background, and then they devote quite a bit of time to Pet Sounds, of course, and how it was recorded. Again, however, without going really into detail, actually, I think you learn more about the recording of Pet Sounds in the very recommended biopic Love and Mercy. Great film about Brian Wilson. Probably one of my favorite biopics ever, one of my favorite films at the moment. The documentary fails a little bit there, but still, of course, manages to underline how important that album was, even though it was not a general success when it came out, and also how it sort of, caused a bit of a rapture within the band. And that leads on to Smile. I think those are the most, pivotal, most important years in the history of the Beach Boys. I'm very happy that the documentary actually didn't stop with Pet Sounds. Before I had seen it, I almost expected the Beach Boys to, just cover the years from 62 to 66 or maybe 67, and then simply maybe finish with the reunion, and That's Why God Made the Radio. That is not the case. We get snippets, very brief glimpses, and, very rushed run through the late 60s and the early 70s. There even are, for my liking, 2 short interviews with Ricky Fattar and Blondie Chaplin, so the early 70s. But this is covered way too quickly for my liking, and I think this would have been a great opportunity to look at least a little bit more into the years after the abandoned Smile project and, up until Holland. Holland is mentioned, again, big plus for this documentary, but really at this point the documentary simply is running out of time. And that's maybe a bit of the problem also with, the scripting or the structure of this documentary. Sometimes I got the feeling that they didn't really know, or they lost focus a bit here, the filmmakers. Neither is this really, a story-based documentary. because, as I said, I think for that you sometimes don't get to know enough about the private backgrounds and what was going on between the band members. But it's also not that kind of, music journalist approach where usually you go through the discography and try to tell the main points of a band's career by means of their albums. Some albums are shown and mentioned, and others are completely neglected. I think Friends, Wild Honey, 2020, those albums are not even mentioned. We get a little bit, you know, a hint at Brian Wilson's profound troubles with drugs and also his mental state. But the entire, I think, really impactful and more than shocking years in which he was, well, not simply under the influence, but more or less a captive or a victim of his psychotherapist. This is completely left out. Also, later on, all the quarrels between the band members, everybody suing each other and suing the records companies. That's also left out. I understand it because that's probably not what you would like to see for 2 hours in a documentary, but it's also, I think, an important, maybe not so entertaining part of the Beach Boys history. What we get, however, and that's one of the most impressive bits of this documentary, for me at least, is the ambivalent role of Maury Wilson and his clearly abusive behavior. At one point, they play a bit of this quite famous tape where Maury was having, well, kind of a very uncomfortable argument with Brian Wilson. He came into the recording studio while Wilson and the boys were recording. At that point, they had already, I think, decided that they did no longer want Maury Wilson as their manager. And this is all put to tape. I've heard this in other documentaries before, or maybe acted out in the Love and Mercy movie. And it's really eerie to be eavesdropping on this very uncomfortable dialogue between Brian Wilson and his own dad. And it clearly shows, it's one of the examples where you really get to feel, you get underneath the surface of the Happy California Boys, and you see that Maury Wilson was not only obviously physical abusive, but how much, emotional, mental pressure he also put on Brian Wilson and most likely also on the other Wilson brothers. So he also was, in my opinion, clearly, psychologically abusive. And that had a disastrous impact on all of the Wilson brothers, I guess. They hint at it, but you never really, they never really go into that too much, even though I think this is one factor that was responsible for all the bad decisions and the troubles the Beach Boys witnessed from the late 60s onwards, culminating in Mike Love suing Brian Wilson. The logical step would have been for Brian Wilson and his brothers, or the entire band actually, to sue Maury Wilson. But of course they didn't do that because, after all, he was their dad. And it's not always the best if you stick to your dysfunctional family system. And sometimes maybe the Beach Boys, or at least Brian Wilson, would have had a happier career if there had been more external persons guiding him instead of his own dad. But then again, Maury Wilson certainly, and I have no doubt about it, was important for the Beach Boys in their early years to, get their career started. And he definitely also protected them in the early years from maybe some not so wise ideas or suggestions from the record company. So a very ambivalent character for me to this day in the Beach Boys history. As mentioned, the documentary completely leaves out decades of Beach Boys history afterwards, and then comes to a, for my taste, very quick, a bit incomplete ending to me. You briefly see the surviving Beach Boys meeting up, I think in a hotel or at the beach. Very personal reunion moment, and it's okay for me that they didn't show too much of it. Some fans, I think, were a bit disappointed. But overall, the last 30 minutes of this documentary seem very rushed, unfocused, and, it just, the story of the Beach Boys fizzles out a bit, and it leaves you hanging there as a viewer. The passing of Dennis Wilson is not mentioned at all, neither the illness and passing of Carl Wilson. You have it in the end credits, just, as a written insert, but I think that's a bit of a strange choice. And overall, yeah, the pacing there, or maybe with the time constraints, the directors, the producers of this documentary somehow didn't really know how to, wrap this thing up in my mind. Overall, this documentary is easy to consummate. It's very linear. It's very conventional in style. Also, the visual choices are, this documentary is not very different from dozens of other well-made music documentaries. Personally, I would have liked to have this Beach Boys documentary to have its own look, maybe also do something a bit more daring in terms of, the visuals or also the structure. As I've said, it's really conventional. They start at the beginning and then quickly move through the most important years, and then suddenly end in the year 2024, a linear structure. But maybe that's also one of the strengths of this documentary, because as I've said, I guess the idea was here to reach out to casual fans of the Beach Boys who maybe never really delved into the history of the band, and to give them a first rather comprehensive, but maybe a bit fast food version of the band's history. And that's what the Beach Boys does really very well. Despite the aspects I've mentioned, maybe this came across as very over critical. I found the Beach Boys to be very entertaining. So at the end of the day, the Beach Boys for me is recommended, especially to people maybe just getting into the Beach Boys, or people who like the hits but never really, bothered about reading too much about the band, but are, interested to get this piece of especially 60s pop music history. The fan in me hopes that this is not the definitive Beach Boys documentary. I've seen this in comments, or written somewhere, people saying this is the definite Beach Boys history and documentary that we're gonna get. I really hope not. There's so much more to, look into. I would rather see this documentary as a kind of maybe starting place to renew interest in the Beach Boys, and to now have other people come up with their documentaries covering certain phases in the Beach Boys history in more detail and, more in depth. The best way probably would have been to do a kind of Beatles anthology approach and do at least 2 parts with 2 hours each, or maybe even a 3-part documentary series about the Beach Boys. I think this would be perfect, and I'm looking forward to maybe see that one day. Anyways, after all, go check out the Beach Boys. Not my favorite take on the Beach Boys, not the best rock documentary I've seen, but definitely well made and enjoyable to watch. Thanks for watching this, and I'm looking forward to your comments on the Beach Boys if you've already seen it, or maybe also your opinions on the Beach Boys in general. And don't forget to like, subscribe. Woo!